Let's discuss 19th century social and economic changes. The Industrial Revolution, the movement of people from farms into factories and mass production, begins in Europe, but gradually works its way over to the United States. And it is in New England where we're going to see the real explosion of factories. Why is New England so great? Geography. The rocky soil prevented any sort of large scale agricultural production, the seaports allow for shipping and foreign trade, and the rivers would help power the factories that allowed for things like textiles, clothing to be produced in mass. There's still going to be agriculture in the north, but when you're a farmer in the northern states, you generally specialize in one or two things rather than producing everything you needed for your household. Uh, you would produce corn or wheat. And then for the other things that you need for your day to day life, you would buy from others. The same is true for people working in factory. They would work in factories all day and then use wages to buy things that they needed for the household. This is the creation of a market economy. In the South, there is not going to be any significant agricultural or industrial development, at all. Oddly enough, it is industry that leads to the creation of something, the cotton gin, that will lead to the explosion of agriculture. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which you see there, allowed for large scale cotton production to be not only possible, but profitable. Prior to this, there was not much cotton produced in the United States. It was labor intensive, particularly when it came to removing the seeds from the sticky fibrous tissue. The cotton gin helps to do that automatically and quickly, and this leads to the expansion of cotton all throughout the South, but with it came the expansion of slavery. So even though the cotton gin seems to be making something less labor intensive, it leads to the expansion of enslaved labor. We can see an example of that here. On the maps on the left-hand side, you can see 1820 and 1860, and you can see how there wasn't a whole lot of cotton production in 1820. By 1860, on the dawn of the Civil War, tremendous cotton production. On the right-hand side, we can see the effect of that on slaves. Again, 1820, there are areas where there really aren't very many slaves at all, but by 1860, right along the same area where you see a lot of cotton production, you see enslaved people making up more than 50% of the population of some counties. The South is going to remain agricultural. The white population is not going to be very diverse because without factory jobs attracting immigration, you're not going to get much from Europe. And of course, you're going to see an ever growing enslaved population in the South. The market revolution that occurs this time, again, refers to this idea of households buying and selling goods rather than making everything for themselves. Free enterprise, the idea of private businesses operating with little to no government regulation, is going to explode. Entrepreneurs, people who invest money and resources to start businesses in order to make profit, are going to be encouraged. Manufactured goods, therefore, are going to become more affordable. When we're producing a lot of stuff efficiently, the price of those goods goes down. This is also going to be aided by improvements in transportation and communication. Now, various regions are going to be interdependent. Southern cotton will be transported to New England to be turned into manufactured goods, textiles. Manufactured goods will be sold back to the South and to the Midwest. The Midwest, in turn, is going to be providing the food for these various areas as well. Those changing technologies that allow for transportation and communication, let's run through a few of them real quickly. The first, and maybe the most significant, is Samuel Morse with his telegraph, the ability to send communication instantaneously over long distances via a wire. This is Morse code that you may have heard of. This allows for orders to be placed. This allows for information about trains and ships to be sent over long periods of time. It's going to incredibly change the economy. Robert Fulton's steamboat is going to allow for rapid transportation going both ways along navigable rivers and eventually across the ocean. Those places where there are not navigable rivers, we're going to see the development of a canal system. Canals are man-made rivers that connect areas that previously were disconnected. Most famous among these, the Erie Canal in upstate New York, that allowed for the Hudson River, which goes in New York City, to be connected to Lake Erie on the other side of the state. And all along that canal, we're going to see an explosion of new cities. In terms of food production, the McCormick Reaper and John Deere steel plow are going to allow for large scale food production, including in places where previously it had not been possible. With all of this change, there's going to be new labor issues that come into existence that previously did not exist. The relationship between the employer and the employee. Prior to industrialization, if there was any manufacturing, a lot of it was done in the home. People who were not farmers generally were some sort of craftsman, an artisan, and they would study under a master and be an apprentice. And you can see examples of that here in this picture of a small workshop where there's a master working and apprentices in the back. Industrialization changes that. Now there's an impersonal relationship between the owner of the factory and the many people who work for that person, such as this individual in this picture working in a firearms factory. Every place a factory would go, there would be cities that would pop up, often called spindle cities, referring to the textile factories that were there. And the people who were working there were called wage slaves, because oftentimes people looked down upon people who would take factory jobs because they felt that they were giving up a certain amount of their freedom in order to work for a wage in a factory. And how we address these issues is going to be a matter of contention for many years to come. But with so many people needed to run the factories, there's going to be a demand for labor. Even though the working conditions were the sort of thing that you and I would never tolerate, the hours, the dangers, and there's not going to be very many successful efforts for people who are working under such harsh conditions to unionize and advocate for any sort of better working conditions. Oftentimes, that's because unions were illegal or laws virtually made them impossible to join. Furthermore, employers could easily fire someone who advocated for better working conditions and find someone new willing to take that job. Oftentimes, the people who would take it were European immigrants. Let's talk about two groups of them really quickly. The Irish. Throughout the 1830s and 40s, we see many people coming over from Ireland, in particular because of the potato famine, which ravaged the Irish countryside, and people had to get out literally to survive and prevent starvation. However, these people oftentimes were quite poor. They took what little money they had and they took a transatlantic trip, which now was more affordable because of the steam-powered ships. But once they got over the United States, they had no more money remaining, and they had to settle in those eastern cities and take whatever job they could get. And at the same time, they were often discriminated against, many times because of their Catholic faith. They had limited education or economic opportunities. However, because their numbers grew so great in places like Boston, in places like New York, in terms of local politics, they were able to unify and exercise a certain amount of power that would give them some control over the local politics of those cities, even if on a national scale they weren't very powerful. Germans are coming over at the same time. Some were coming over because they were political refugees. Others are displaced farmers. Generally speaking, they were more economically stable when they came over, which meant that after they booked passage to the United States and they arrived, they had enough money to keep moving on. They didn't have to stay in those cities and take the low-paying jobs. Many moved to the Midwest, places like Ohio or Wisconsin, where they might even be able to buy land. As a result, they're not going to be as politically potent, but they certainly are going to have a huge cultural impact. They brought with them a belief in public education and the idea of kindergarten, something that is adopted in the United States. The Christmas tree and many of the things that we associate with Christmas today come over from Germany. Beer is something that didn't exist in large part in the United States, even though a lot of people drank alcohol to excess. But Germans bring with them beer, and we see the breweries popping up all over the Midwest. Perhaps most importantly, they are fierce advocates of abolition. And as the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement grows, it is going to be people of German descent who are going to be very active in that. As a result of so much immigration, there's going to be a backlash, discrimination. Nativism is anti foreigner prejudice. Many native born Americans feared the influence of immigrants on economics, on culture, and on politics. This is, of course, hypocritical because when we're talking about the white population of the United States, it wasn't long ago, prior to this time, that the grandparents, the ancestors of many people alive at this time themselves were immigrating to this country. And now they were viewing recent immigrants with disdain, particularly, again, Catholics. We see violence against Catholics, churches, schools being burned, and we even see a political movement known as the Know Nothing Party explode. Know Nothing Party was an anti immigrant, anti Catholic political party. It sought to restrict immigration and make it very difficult for people who were here, immigrants, to have any sort of political influence. They're called Know Nothings because of the secretive nature of their organization. Another group of people who all of this industrialization is going to change life for are going to be women. Women became part of factory production due in large part because the factories were replacing some of the work that traditionally had been done in the home, in particular, the creation of clothes. However, jobs that were available for women, even if they were low paying and not very good jobs, did provide a level of economic independence that had never been seen before. Most famous among these are the factory girls that worked in Lowell, Massachusetts. Factory girls generally worked for 6 days a week, 12 to 13-hour days, but it didn't end when they clocked out for the day. They were supervised on and off the job. They would be escorted to church. They would be taken back to the boarding house where they would live. They could not form unions. All of these things reflected the paternalistic and sexist view at the time that women, even if they could work in a factory, could not be treated as equals with men. And so that led to this harsh supervision and controlling all aspects of their day. And yet, it was an important first step for women trying to gain some level of economic independence, economic stability away from a husband. It should be pointed out that most of the women working in these situations were young, unmarried farm girls. And generally speaking, if a woman got married, her time in a factory came to an end. While this was not widespread across the country, it certainly was significant at the time in that particular area of New England. But it didn't matter if you were a woman, if you were a man, if you were an immigrant or native born, when you were working in factories during this period of industrialization, your work life was pretty bad. And there weren't a whole lot of outlets to improve your work situation. As I mentioned before, throughout the 1830s and 1840s, there's going to be limited success by unions to advocate for shorter hours, higher pay, and better safety standards. And again, that's because of the politics of the time and the laws that were in place. However, an important court case is Commonwealth versus Hunt. This comes out of the state of Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. While it doesn't guarantee unions the right to strike, it does claim that unions are not in and of themselves illegal or illegal conspiracies, so long as their methods were honorable and peaceful. And this is an important first step toward further workers' rights. And it will lay the groundwork, rather, for future struggles between ownership and labor in the decades to come, particularly after the Civil War.